Phenomenal authorization is a concept that has to do with the relationship between authorship, authorization, and authority. Very much in line with the post-structuralist hermeneutics developed from out of Heidegger's thought, and implicit even in the Kabbalistic dimension of Kafka's writing, the worldhood of the world, to use Heidegger's phrase, is proto-textual in nature. This is actually what was intended from the very first philosophical usage of the term logos by Heraclitus of Ephesus, long before that term was retroactively associated with reductively mathematical or analytical logic. Originally, the idea of logos was that the structure on account of which our universe is referred to as a cosmos or ordered array is akin to the warp and weft of a grand narrative or superstory. Stories, like dreams, can involve absurd elements that are illogical from the perspective of a quasi-mathematical or reductively analytic logic, but that make sense narratively, at least on a subconscious level, and are therefore encompassed by the original conception of logos. Surrealist poetry is still logos, and events can transpire in our cosmos that are more akin to surrealist poetry than they are to anything logically analyzable or describable in terms of a chain of causality that can be mathematically schematized. As I had argued in two of the essays on free will in Lovers of Sophia, individual persons are at least potentially co-authors over the narrative structure of the cosmos. But clearly, authorship is the prerogative of only a few, since most people are no better than non-player characters in the massively multiplayer online role-playing games of the early 21st century, which I had discussed in Prometheism. Authorship belongs not only to authors in the literal sense of writers, but to any creator who reshapes the worldhood of our world at the most fundamental level, namely the level of the folklore that conditions the substratum of the collective and personal unconscious of people in one or another society of a world increasingly globalized by technological inframing, to use another Heideggerian term. Not all authors are authors in this sense. In fact, most writers definitely are not, but a number of filmmakers, painters, even graphic novelists like Alan Moore or Grant Morrison, and musicians are authors in this sense. That is, if they are contributing to the creation of what I call novel folklore. The title of my book, Novel Folklore, does not simply refer to Sadeh Hedayat's novel. It is an idea that I have developed with a considerable debt to Nietzsche and Heidegger. Hedayat's Blind Owl is folklore in the form of a novel, which is somewhat paradoxical. Folklore is the oldest narrative structure that we have in human history. It is usually dominant in oral cultures, although it survives past the advent of literature. I would agree with Heidegger that it still forms the substrate of every society today. Folklore is associated with tribal cultures and is the oldest form of narrative. Hedayat was a folklorist, but the novel is the most modern form of literary expression. We had people like Petronius penning Satyricon in the Roman period, and other prose narratives that were similar to novels, but they were not quite the same. The revolution of subjectivity occurred around the time of Descartes, where first-person narratives emerged for the first time, beginning with his own Discourse on the Method, a scientific text that strangely prefigures the novel. This turning point had not taken place yet in the Roman epoch, although one can imagine that it would have occurred before long in Alexandria had it not been for the catastrophic collapse into the Christian Middle Ages. Since the novel is a quintessentially modern form of expression, the phrase novel folklore is somewhat ironic and paradoxical. In novel folklore, I argued that Hedayat's Blind Owl is an attempt at fusing the folkloric with the novel. But there is a deeper meaning of novel folklore as a philosophical idea that is integral to my concept of phenomenal authorization, and that has to do with attempting to generate a new folklore as the basis of the evolution of a society. What determines who is or is not an author contributing to weaving the tapestry of the logos that makes a cosmos from out of chaos is a double-sided or bidirectional function of authorization. Authorship can authorize what phenomena are accepted as possible experiences and what other phenomena are suppressed from at least widespread manifestation on account of being deemed impossible and pushed to the fringe or margins of whatever reality is thereby defined. For example, there is no question that the authorship of Stephen King in the late 20th century was working at cross purposes with the entrenched materialist and mechanistic paradigm of the scientific establishment. It is not a question of what one personally feels about the aesthetic merit of King's novels, or the lack thereof. His influence, including through film adaptations, was quite literally phenomenal, and it operated on a society-wide scale precisely on the subconscious stratum of folklore. The same was true of Whitley Strieber, for better or for worse. What the case of Strieber highlights is the flip side of this function of authorization. Those whose authorship authorizes the forms taken by phenomenal manifestation are in turn authorized by something. Their process of phenomenal authorship is either initiated by what authorizes them, or their creative endeavors are of a kind such as to solicit the vital interest and active concern of an authorizing force that allows them to act as a medium for the reshaping of reality. This brings us to the final element in the constellation of three author-related terms, namely authority. Whoever happens to be in an explicit position of political, economic, or even social power is not necessarily the true authority in the world. In the early 21st century, no one with half a brain any longer believes that the elected representatives of any government are really the powers that be. While this might be more believable of corporate executives, the volatile rise and fall and vicious turns of fortune in the lives of such men, and they are mostly men, strains the credibility of such a proposition, especially since the only power that these men have is their often undeserved fortune. Finally, social power is now held mostly by social media influencers and trendsetters who are essentially no better than the premier gossip peddlers of late 19th century women's salon attendees. This can hardly be counted as authority. Real authority within the context of one or another world is the authority to define the limits of that world, or at least to play a significant role in defining those parameters that determine what is or is not possible. The first accurate image of ultimate authority in the history of philosophy is Plato's allegorical depiction of the puppet masters on the plank above the shackled prisoners who can only see the shadow play on the cave wall in front of them. The authors who authorize phenomena are the authorities who are phenomenally authorized to do so. These very rare individuals have phenomenal authorization. There are many seeming contradictions and apparent paradoxes in my books. These are keys to open up an esoteric dimension of Prometheism. Consider a few examples. In Prometheus and Atlas, what could possibly have been meant by saying that Mercury mirrors Prometheus, and there is probably no Zeus because Mercury murdered Zeus a long time ago and has pretended to be Zeus by wearing his mask ever since? How could Islam be a creation of Mithraic Parthians, putatively for the purpose of inoculating Sasanian Iran against totalitarian ways of thinking and being, as is argued in Iranian Leviathan, if Islam is one of the Abrahamic revelations promulgated by the tyrannical leader of the Elohim or Devas, the being called Yahweh, Zeus, or Indra, as is claimed in both Prometheus and Atlas and Closer Encounters. Why use Whitley Strieber's Communion as a principal example of novel folklore in the book by that name, if Whitley Strieber is as much a victim of theologizing mind control as Betty Andreasen, who was taken by the Greys to meet Nordic angels who introduced her to the white light of God and who promised the imminent return of Jesus the Messiah? Is the Gnostic Christ in fact Mithra, as suggested in Iranian Leviathan, or is Gnosticism just another variant of the cognitive dissonance that we have been subjected to by the gods or angels? What is the connection between the appearance of Artemis in the essay on Kafka in Lovers of Sophia and the reappearance of Artemis, sometimes in passages reproduced verbatim, in the context of the discussion of early Mithraism in Iranian Leviathan? And why is the symbolism of a black dog sacrifice to Artemis at the esoteric core of Faustian Futurist? More questions of this kind could be formulated, and every such question holds a key to the esoteric truth of phenomenal authorization. This esotericism has everything to do with Plato's philosophical concept of the noble lie. Plato uses the term noble lie at 414 to 415 in his Republic. The context is a discussion about eugenics by means of arranged marriages. He proposes a lottery that would appear to be random, but that would really combine couples in a way that would be favorable to eugenically enhancing the population. But the noble lie plays a much more significant role in Republic than simply in terms of this particular policy. A more prominent example of it is when Plato argues that the masses in any given society require some religion in order to cultivate their moral character. He considers the Homeric folk religion of his time as having had a deleterious effect on the upbringing of children. In his view, children are corrupted by being raised on Homeric epics and the customary religion canonized by Hesiod. So he proposes that the guardians design a religion that would be more suitable to the cultivation of the ethical character of the population than the customary Greek religion. This would, however, be a theology that guardians themselves do not believe in. This proposal that the philosopher rulers of the ideal state ought to manufacture a religious doctrine that is false but conducive to the moral development of the masses is another significant example of the noble lie in the Republic. Republic is not the only Platonic text where this idea of the noble lie emerges in some form. In his 7th letter, Plato comes out with the shocking statement that, quote, "No one has ever studied the doctrine of Plato," unquote. He asserts that if they claim that they have, they are lying. Given that he has written tens of texts that would appear to expound his doctrine, the implication here is that all of his writings are exoteric expressions of a hidden esoteric teaching that can only be discerned from between the lines, as it were, by those initiates with the eyes to see it or the ears to hear it. Plato has never revealed his actual philosophical views in a direct fashion. In other words, throughout his entire project, he has engaged in numerous noble lies. Plato's idea of the noble lie is rooted in the history of the Pythagorean order, a secret society to which he himself belonged, meaning to which he had taken an oath of secrecy. Pythagoras was at the head of a very elitist secret society, wherein even among those who belonged to the order, there was a distinction between an inner circle and an outer circle. The first man behind the curtain was neither the Wizard of Oz nor Dr. Mabuse, but Pythagoras, who literally sat behind a curtain or veil that separated him and his inner circle, who sat around his feet, from the others who had to listen to his lectures from behind this curtain. If anyone were to reveal any secrets of the order to the public, the penalty was death. So although the Pythagorean theorem was not a particularly sensitive piece of information, the member who publicly revealed it was, as a matter of principle, sentenced to death by being ferried out into shark-infested waters where his brothers in the order threw him overboard. Why was this degree of secrecy required in the Pythagorean order? Because it had a revolutionary program for the transformation of society. For example, in a serious violation of the conventional morality of the time, women were admitted into the Pythagorean order, where some of them went on to become teachers of the highest rank. The Pythagoreans also recognized the phenomenon of reincarnation, which was at odds with the customary ancient Greek religion. The Pythagoreans were attempting to seize control of the government of Sicily, and they were positioning initiates of the order in high levels of this regime. When the traditional aristocrats became aware of this, they rallied the rabble against the Pythagoreans and staged a coup that ended with the burning of the main Pythagorean academy. Classical biographers speculated that either Pythagoras died in that fire, or he died shortly thereafter from severe burns and other injuries that he suffered in the course of this calamity. Plato, as a member of the Pythagorean order, is looking back at the destruction of this academy, and he realizes that, since he has to operate in the Athenian agora, the public space, he has to express himself even more esoterically than the Pythagoreans in order to advance his agenda. He became especially resolved on this view on account of the execution of his mentor, Socrates, by the Democratic Assembly of Athens, on charges of heresy, promulgating impiety, and corrupting the minds of the youth. None of this stopped Plato from following in the footsteps of Pythagoras by attempting to turn the tyrant, quote-unquote, Dionysus, into a philosopher king who would transform the city-state of Syracuse into something along the lines of the Callipolis, or utopian state that Plato had envisioned in Republic. This fiasco almost turned Plato into another martyr, like Socrates and Pythagoras. After established elites in the court of Dionysus conspired against the philosopher, Plato had to be smuggled out of Syracuse by boat in the middle of the night. Leo Strauss is rightly considered the most influential Platonist in the contemporary epoch, at least when it comes to elaborating on Plato's sociopolitical philosophy. Strauss was a German Jew who escaped the rise of Nazism and became a very influential professor at the University of Chicago. But before he relocated from Germany to the United States, Strauss was an intellectual student of Martin Heidegger and literally a student of Carl Schmitt. These two men may have been the most prominent intellectuals who were also card-carrying members of the Nazi Party. In fact, Heidegger and Schmitt coincidentally wound up standing on line together to sign up to become Nazis on the same day. Later, they collaborated in the reconstruction of the German academic system along the lines envisioned by the National Revolution of 1933. In an essay titled An Introduction to Heideggerian Existentialism, Leo Strauss claims that Heidegger is the only living philosopher. The essay was written in the 1960s. Strauss made a point of saying that he did not consider himself worthy of being referred to as a philosopher, since he was a mere political thinker engaged in interpreting the history of philosophy. Such high praise for a leading Nazi intellectual coming from a Jew who fled persecution is quite striking indeed. Strauss also wrote extensive notes on Carl Schmitt's Concept of the Political, which was the jurist's most important work and the one that most influenced Nazi German thought on constitutional and international law. Schmitt is on record for his deep appreciation of these notes and for his recognition that they represented the most astute reflection on his ideas that any of his students had produced. Quite a striking statement from a leading Nazi legal and political theorist with respect to a Jew. Leo Strauss also took Nietzsche very seriously. He was not just a student of Plato and Aristotle, he was also a student of Nietzsche's critique of modern rationality and the modern rejection of the noble lie. In his essay on a supposed right to lie, which is often amalgamated with his Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, Immanuel Kant claims that it is never justified to tell a lie. As Kant argues in the Groundwork, the only actions that are ethical are ones based on a maxim that can be universalized. In other words, if the logic of one's actions cannot be translated into some principle that everyone can universally adhere to as a maxim for their action, then one is engaging in unethical behavior. Kant's categorical imperative is really a sophisticated, if not sophistical, and abstract reiteration of the golden rule that one ought not to do unto others what one wishes that they would not do to oneself. If the maxim of your action is to be kind to others, that is ethical because if it were to be universally implemented, it would be beneficial to society. But if you think that, in some particular instance, you are justified in stealing, the maxim of that action cannot be universalized, because if everyone were to steal and try to justify their acts of theft, society would be torn apart and we would have violent chaos. By this same logic, Kant argues that lying is never justified, because if everyone always thought that they were justified in lying to anyone else, then interpersonal and institutional trust, or even the reliability of scientific claims, would break down to the point where society would become totally dysfunctional. Among other things, the criminal justice system would cease to function amidst such rampant deception and deceitful manipulation. Notice that this is so idiotic that Nazis who would come to the door of a good German citizen would, according to Kant, have to be told the truth about the Jews hiding in the man's attic, since otherwise the man who had taken in the Jewish fugitives would be lying unethically. He could implore the SS officers not to harm the Jews and voice his conscientious objection to state persecution of the Jews, at the risk of being arrested himself, but he would have to lead the SS officers up to the attic nonetheless. Nietzsche levels a scathing critique at this way of thinking, which is epitomized by Kant, but characteristic of modern Enlightenment intellectuals. Kant is falsely assuming that everyone is equal. The universality of the categorical imperative, or for that matter, the Christian golden rule, implicitly presupposes this claim and is contingent upon its being true. Nietzsche thinks that this is, however, very far from being true. Not everyone is equal, and not everyone is even worthy of being treated equally. Strauss agrees wholeheartedly with Nietzsche in this regard. Although Strauss is widely regarded as a classicist, his reading of Plato and Aristotle is mediated through his understanding of Nietzsche. Strauss's view that esoteric writing is necessary in order for a philosopher to avoid severe persecution is also based on this position. Some people deserve to be lied to. It is their own fault that they have to be lied to, and those who have to lie to them are the ones really being harmed here. Only the true nobility of spiritual aristocrats deserve never to be subjected to machinations based on noble lies. Lying to the truly noble is ignoble, but lying to most people is not only justified, it is necessary. Until and unless they can be gotten rid of altogether, the willfully ignorant and mindless masses need to be handled in a way that minimizes the potential damage that they could do, not only to each other, but especially to the geniuses, the unconventional thinkers and visionary creators in their society. The rabble want truth as little as they want real freedom, and they are far from being capable of handling either in a responsible fashion. Rather, most people want to be lied to and they want to be led, but in a way that is hidden well enough to flatter their pathetic egos with the pleasing illusion that they are free agents being presented with all of the facts. In the Republic, Plato suggests that the philosopher kings ought to be the people designing the religion of the commoners. This goes back to the concept of the noble lie. Plato recognizes that the rank and file of society, mass man, requires something like religious belief in order to secure social stability. He saw the Olympian religion of his society, as epitomized by Homer and Hesiod, as detrimental to the development of the ethical fiber of children. So he suggested that the philosopher rulers of the state ought to craft a new religion, which consists, in a sense, of noble lies, but these lies are noble because they do constructively guide masses of people toward the cultivation of virtues and, over time, inculcate them with a constructive ethos. God is an invention of the devil. The diabolos, whose name derives from the ancient Greek word diabolein, signifying the dynamic tension of setting forces in dialectical opposition to one another for the sake of generative strife. The Devas did not create the revealed Abrahamic religions. Reread the chapter on Iranian Zionism in Iranian Leviathan, the one comically titled Tekel Tekel Men Eshekel. Put it next to Closer Encounters. The Abrahamic revelations were invented by Prometheus to shatter the divine power of the Devas with their quasi-philosophically justified totalitarian caste system based on rarefied notions such as the mirroring of the macrocosm of Brahman in the microcosm of Atman and the cosmic order of Rata in the divinely ordered society of the Satya Yuga. This is not to say that the Devas did not become the Elohim and play into this new theological framework, but as soon as they did so, they were playing a game whose rules were being set by Prometheus for the sake of the ultimate undermining of all faith in what comes down from on high, based on paternalistic authority and sanctified tradition. Look back at the metaphor of the funhouse mirror in the discussion of Hermes in the closing chapter on mercurial hermeneutics in Prometheus and Atlas. The Abrahamic revelations were intended to be a farcical, self-deconstructing mockery of a system of hierarchical divine command and servile human obedience. Their purpose was only able to be perverted by devas who played into this narrative because it turns out that the vast majority of people actually want to be enslaved. They hate freedom and they loathe those who want to be free. Just as Plato had already suggested in the allegory of the cave at the core of Republic, the mob is always ready to lynch whoever has the bright idea of trying to free their fellows from enslaving illusions and delusions. Who would actually worship Yahweh or Allah for centuries? Nothing human, that's for sure. Definitely creatures who are far more contemptible than any wild beast. Nothing, I won't even say no one, who deserves a future, or who can be trusted to be part of a future built on the basis of open access to potentially very dangerous singularity-level technologies and psychic techniques. The devil invented the meta-narrative of the Abrahamic God, quote unquote, as a noble lie to test the, quote, humanity, unquote, of man. The verdict is that man must be replaced. Prometheus was the father and long-suffering advocate of an undeserving and ungrateful creature who proved to be monstrous by choosing to serve an incredibly grotesque scarecrow. Prometheus will now return to his laboratory and fashion a new, post-human progeny. The enemy is real. The Devas are real. They really did embrace the image of being angelic Elohim. They are denizens of a traditionalist, time-traveling breakaway civilization that is sadistically tyrannical and that attempts to provide philosophical justifications for a static hierarchical structure that stifles social progress and the creative evolution of the individual. But the enemy only reacts. We are the actors. We have been the authorized. They are not authorized. We authorized them as the black pieces on our chessboard. Yes, the black and white squared board preserved from Atlantean times by the Freemasonic Order. It is Mithra, the mediator, who authorizes Ahriman to move against Ahura Mazda, so that there can be the constraint that is a precondition for constructive order. For every action of ours, the enemy engages in some reaction that forwards a game whose aim and end they have never properly grasped. Maximal and indefinitely extended creation, the categorical imperative of the Promethean. She is the authorizer of the authority of the authors of phenomena. Even the most tragic figures among the authors of phenomena, the revolutionary martyrs, the impoverished inventors, and the visionary starving artists, have been akin to the coyote trickster of the American Indians, who plays dead in order to get the upper hand, albeit not necessarily in the same lifetime, and not for him or herself alone, but for the Promethean, who is the creatrix of the cosmic game. She confers phenomenal authorization. There are no laws of nature, but only habitual patterns of organization that form chaos into a cosmos based on the subconscious structure of the collective psyche of beings such as ourselves. It is not just that scientific paradigms change and condition our perception of nature in one or another limited way, as Thomas Kuhn would argue. Rather, more in anticipation of Paul Feyerabend, the maverick paranormal researcher Charles Fort goes so far as to say that our paradigms, which he calls dominants, actually shape a field of raw energy and potentiality into a certain order that counts for a law-like nature in the first place. When there is a change of the dominant, which includes not just a prevailing scientific paradigm, but entrenched belief systems in every domain, including religion and politics, then the world itself changes, and other experiences become possible. There could, for example, be a world where it is possible for us to routinely pass through what we now take to be solid objects, although such an experience of reality might become quite disorienting. The atoms that constitute these seemingly solid objects do not really exist. At its most fundamental, or rather at its most abyssal level, the quantum potential of the cosmos is an energetic chaos, a seething dynamic medium that inextricably interacts with the psyche, albeit on a subconscious and collective or intersubjective level, in order to shape what we take to be reality. The trickster that Fort was already onto has, as the basic motivation of its multifarious machinations, the destabilization of dominants that have been entrenched for too long and that are rendering life stagnant and sterile. If we were to understand this and redefine our relationship with this trickster to one that is more constructive than the fortress mentality of the breakaway civilization with its cyclopean architecture, then the skinwalker may transform as well. Scientific studies at Skinwalker Ranch reach the conclusion that this trickster is a precognitive sentient phenomenon, PSP, and perhaps its precognitive anticipatory mindedness is the same quality that the Greeks referred to as Promethea. Maybe we can bring a new and more dynamic dominant into being, in the context of which the trickster will appear in her most beneficently humanitarian form, Prometheus. Is Prometheus an avatar, an egregoric projection, or a shamanic mask of a more primordial trickster who could present herself to us as Promethea, the Aeon, the same Aeon that Heraclitus referred to as the childlike player of the cosmic game? Can we really blame an intelligence operating on the fifth dimensional level of the control system of the Matrix if it demands that we step up our game before being allowed to tinker with the fabric of 4D spacetime? This world is not like the Wizard of Oz, where you can just force your way behind the curtain and into the control room, where the levers of reality are there for you to mess with as you please. To become players of the cosmic game, rather than simply being played, a higher level of complexity and a deeper understanding may be demanded of us. I am not talking about goodness. Maybe we are expected to be capable of more interesting wickedness. Who is it that really gives us clues about itself by taking the form of mantid aliens, or that shapeshifts into an oversized owl when it is not pretending to be a gray? Is it someone like Q from Star Trek: The Next Generation? Is it Loki with his wolf and his serpents? The cosmic trickster is the master of totemic masks. If this intelligence is approached from out of the trickster aspect of Prometheus, will she be unmasked as Promethea? The scientists who turned the Skinwalker Ranch into a field laboratory for studying the trickster came to only one firm conclusion: that the quintessential character of the thing is that it is a precognitive sentient phenomenon. In other words, it repeatedly and spectacularly displays its Promethea, or forethought. Are we dealing with so many wondrous and monstrous masks of the Aeon, Promethea? In Iranian Gnosticism, there is an allegory known as the seduction of the archons, where Mithra seduces female archons in his male form and turns himself into the most beautiful woman to seduce male archons and make them ejaculate, and thereby liberate the light of humanity that they have devoured. This idea of seducing archons instead of being seduced by them was at the basis of various forms of tantric gnosis, from the Mazdakite movement of Iran to the Carpocratian doctrine of Alexandria. Like Prometheus, Mithra is a fire-bearing trickster who aims to enlighten humanity. Like Prometheus, Mithra operates beyond the binary conflict between gods and titans. As an umpire in the struggle between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, he is not unfair to the devil. Rather, he is diabolical in the original Greek sense of the word diabolein, a throwing through of dynamically opposed forces for the sake of creative tension. As Heraclitus understood, the Aeon is a child at play, moving pieces in a cosmic game of perpetual war. Are we being seduced by the Promethean? And if so, what if we were to turn around and seduce her instead? In order to differentiate this Aeon from the Greek mythological figure of Prometheus, which would have to be retrospectively seen as an avatar of this Aeon, I propose that we refer to her as Promethea. This name, which is equivalent to the Greek word for the forethought that is the defining quality of Prometheus, also calls to mind the scientist's description of the trickster at Skinwalker Ranch as a precognitive sentient phenomenon. The survival of something like humanity, albeit in a dramatically changed form, depends on our being able to coax the trickster into becoming our Promethean. We need to choose the form of the destructor very wisely, as the Ghostbusters understood, and to choose it with a sense of humor commensurate to engagement with the trickster.